Great, so I think we'll kick off. So hello everyone. I'm Rosie Jackson. I'm Director of Policy and Innovation at the CDAC Network. Many thanks for joining us in our session today as part of the HNPW event. We're very happy to welcome you all to join us in a conversation about digital access and its impact on transforming communication as aid. We recognise this as a particularly large topic, and in this session, we will attempt to unpack some of the key issues. We'll challenge ourselves to better understand the opportunities for greater communication and accountability, and we'll try as hard as we can to end with some actionable next steps. I am joined by 4 informed and digitally curious panelists, and our conversation will be supported by 3 clips from earlier interviews with expert practitioners. It's more than a decade since CDAC was set up by UN agencies, NGOs and Red Cross Red Crescent with media development and other specialist organisations to systematically embed communication and community engagement in humanitarian action. Together we work on improving dialogue, on issues of inclusion and participation with the aim of shifting the dial on decision making within the sector. The principles of our endeavour remain the same, but the means by which we communicate with and engage affected populations has evolved significantly. One of the principal drivers of this is digital technology and its exponential growth. Mobile devices, tablets and other ways that people are connected to the internet has accelerated the speed with which information travels. Digital communities are formed, dialogue thrives, and connections are made that wouldn't have been possible in the past. Feedback is certainly given and discussed, so whether we hear it or not. Either way, anyone with an internet connection has the potential to make their voices heard. And yet, while the digital advance has been remarkable, we know it's not been even. It's estimated that hundreds of millions of people will be connected to the internet through mobile devices by 2025, but this leaves many, many more behind. There's been a recent spotlight on how the spread of information, and particularly misinformation, has led some governments to restrict access to the internet or shut it down completely. If the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digital uptake, it's also deepened the digital divide. So we know that any growth in the use of digital technologies won't be even. The risks are well discussed, I think. Breaches in data privacy, misinformation or the distortion of truth, and digital disparity and how this might alienate certain communities. But with these risks at the front of our mind, we want to talk about these, but also the opportunities that there are in terms of deploying digital technologies in communication and community engagement in humanitarian action. We know this isn't a new topic. CDAC members have been working in this space for over a decade and focus on promoting and improving understanding of digital access and mitigating the risks. It's a dynamic and progressive debate in cash transfers, in many of the other service sectors. And ODI and GSMA have just produced quite recent studies on digital trends and risks emerging in COVID-19. Technologies play an important role in how we communicate and engage communities at the moment, but this will only grow in the future. We know it's not new to communities. Most communities have long been digitally literate and are deeply connected through digital devices. So let's talk about what we need to do to catch up. Before we get stuck in, some housekeeping, please do join us and continue this discussion on social media. Our Twitter handle is CDACN and the hashtags are HNPW and ComisAid. So please keep the discussion live on social media. Please do use the comments box to ask and answer each other's questions during the discussion, make comments, agree, disagree. We're all been to lots of these events now, and often the discussion box is as interesting as the thing that we're watching. So please do work away. We'll be trying to use some of your comments during the course of the discussion. One more thing, during the event, we will be doing a temperature check on where our audience believe we are as a sector, and we'll be using Mentimeter, but we'll put the link in at the time and I will signpost that to you. So thanks for listening to my introduction. We're going to kick off now with one of our pre-recorded interviews. We wanted to present or to show an example of emergency peer-to-peer communications as they are evolving. You don't need to be an expert or part of a large organization anymore. You don't need to have the skills. Everyone can learn quickly. It's cheap, it's available, it's provided by private industry. We spoke to Insia Khan from More Viral Than the Virus, set up by a group of medical and healthcare students from around the world. They took it upon themselves in their spare time, without financing or training, to embark upon a bottom-up approach to community engagement. They now estimate that they reach an audience of 1.5 million in 100 countries. Insia is the India lead. It's worth noting that this was recorded a few weeks ago, before the devastating deterioration in the COVID situation in India. Let's hear from Insia.
Hi, I'm Insia Khan, Deputy Director for More Viral Than the Virus and the Indian lead for More Viral Than the Virus India. I am a therapeutic radiography student. The bottom-up approach is all about community engagement at a very local or a bottom level, like completely down. And that is by me contacting or speaking to my friends and telling them, okay, did you read about this myth? Do you know it's wrong? Do you know how we can stop it? And the person is like, yeah, I know, let's do something about it. And that is exactly how we got everyone to join us. And through them we reached older people as well, because everyone was locked in their houses, everyone was in the pandemic, like it or not, they were in the same house as their parents or grandmothers or everyone. And even though there was a lot of frustration, but educating them was coming from people who knew about things. What we see with humanitarian actors like UN or WHO, there is so much, such good, beautiful information that WHO has that they're releasing, and we ourselves look at that information, and that is the major information that we're spreading out to everyone. What WHO and CDC are publishing, and but what do we see? What we saw was there were more of doctors, more of medical students who were inclined towards this education because like it or not, they're into medicine, so they understand. And also, one other thing we saw, that they did not tackle the language barrier as much. And even if there was information, that information wasn't reaching the people all the way down. Like it wasn't spreading to a level it should. And that is why we thought there's so many organizations that are having a top-down approach. Maybe it's time to start something from a bottom-up approach, so that people at lower levels, when I say lower levels, who do not have access to social media or do not understand a certain language or are facing so many barriers, understand and get that information, because these are the people who are most susceptible to the disease. And this is where we see the disease is spreading the most. What we do is we take actions within local countries now. We do not have to follow a huge protocol or guideline in order to, spread that information, because that time that we're losing spreading or getting things accepted or getting things moving forward is the time we're losing, and we're losing those many people within that time. And I think that is something that More Viral Than the Virus, I would say, started off with. We did not imagine to reach 1.5 million people. That we were shocked when we saw that, and we were surprised. But we thought, why not just start with giving information to people now? And people need information now. I know there's a lot to think about, like a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan and a 20-year plan, but we need things right now. People need information right now.
Painful reminder of how important the topic is today. So in a world where anyone can do this, how are we as humanitarians keeping up? To help me explore this, I'm joined by 4 people with very different interests in digital communications, but with one thing in common. They're long-time experts and watchers of this space. So let's see how we can navigate this together. So without further ado, let me bring in our panelists. So we're going to start with Suya Sangupta. Suya is an activist and has written extensively about the need to decolonize the internet. She is co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge. She has led initiatives in India, in the USA, across the global south, and internationally for 20 years to amplify marginalized voices in virtual and physical worlds. She is the former Chief Grant-Making Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, former Regional Program Director at the Global Fund for Women, and a 2017 Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow. She received a 2018 Internet and Society Award from the Oxford Internet Institute and is on the Scholars Council for UCLA's Centre for Critical Internet Inquiry. Welcome, Suya. Connie Moon-Sehat leads the News Quality Initiative, an effort by the Toe Knight Centre for Entrepreneurial Journalism at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism and is supported by Hackers. She's a senior fellow in media, entertainment and sports industries at the World Economic Forum and has focused on the intersections of technology and democratic life for the past 20 years, including the direction of projects like News Frames at Global Voices, the New Orleans Research Collaborative, and ELMO, the Election, Human Rights and Health Monitoring Initiative. Hi, Connie. Next up, Irene Scott. Irene is the head of Internews's Rooted in Trust project, which uses digital communications in their risk communication effort around COVID-19. She's a communicator who specializes in connecting communities affected by crisis with trustworthy and actionable information and building systems that allow them to engage with first responders. In the last 8 years, she's worked in the Pacific, South Sudan, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, and Europe, designing community engagement and feedback mechanisms, risk communication, humanitarian radio, and rumor tracking programs. Irene started her career as a radio presenter and digital storyteller. Hi, Irene. So last but no means least, Nancy Groves. Nancy is the Digital Strategy Chief of the United Nations Environment Programme. Her unit manages the all-web, social media and internal communications activities, as well as coordinates UNEP's outreach and responses to journalists and media partnerships. Before transitioning into this role, Nancy headed the 25-person team that manages the UN's global social media presences, which now have 30 million fans and followers. In addition to planning, coordinating and carrying out broader UN system social media initiatives in 8 languages, her team wrote and implemented social media policies and guidelines. So you can see that we're in very safe hands for our discussion today. Welcome, ladies. So let's get started on questions. Nancy, I'm going to come to you first. We saw from INSEA about their peer-to-peer initiative and how this was set up. If this is relatively easy for a group of young people and students to build this 100-country network of risk communication communicators, surely it must be even easier for the UN humanitarian agencies. But tell us a bit about where we are now.
Well, I would say nothing is really easy in the UN context with so many crises happening, so many different interests, lack of funding. But yes, there are so many dedicated colleagues who really are trying to do their best to really rapidly adapt to the changing technologies. I mean, and as you mentioned earlier, everyone can be a communicator. So I think something that I know many of the UN colleagues are doing is really trying to invest in training perhaps non-traditional communicators to really help out, because anyone with a phone can capture testimony or a video or a photo from anyone in the field. But then they need some basic training and a plan to capture how to, submit what you get through the appropriate channels. And then also to ask the right kind of questions and to, if you're, interviewing a parent with a child, you'd certainly need to, ask if what personal details could be shared. And a trained communicator would think of that, but now that everyone has a smartphone, that's perhaps not the case for everyone. So the big challenge, I think, for communicators is trying not just to figure out how to use all of these platforms and to meet the demands for information as all of this changes so quickly. I think one of the big challenges is to figure out how to invest in training materials, time, and that's, I don't know, time is a finite resource. So I would be interested to know if our other panelists have thoughts on that.
It's interesting. Thanks, Nancy. So talking about skills, I mean, Suya, maybe just to come to you, do you think this news borderless way of communicating is something that humanitarians are ready to take on? Nancy there was talking a bit about the skills that were needed, but what do you think?
So it's interesting because in some ways we are simultaneously in very bordered and in a borderless world. I think thinking of ourselves as only in a borderless world is not always true, because the physical infrastructures of the internet are still physical and still controlled by technology companies and governments. So I think the way to think about it is that communication in many ways on the internet is the same as communication in the real world has always been. What has shifted is, depending on access, the speed and the reach of that communication. But people have always talked. People have always told each other about crises. People have always had the conversations around what to do. What can happen is that you can have a much richer context of connection. So I, for instance, am sitting right now in London thinking very deeply about all my family, friends, and communities in India. And I've spent the entire morning and much of my last few weeks sort of supporting organizing that's happening in India and thinking about what organizing can happen outside India that will help. So as someone who is not in the humanitarian sector at this moment in time, but is digitally connected, those are the ways in which one can be supportive. But I do think it's important to recognize that it isn't a simple borderless or world, and that, you know, the communication in some ways is just expanded, but hasn't fundamentally necessarily changed as much as we think it has.
I like that. I mean, it hasn't changed, and I think that's we work on that principle. But like you said, maybe there's opportunities in terms of how it's expanded. One of the things during our interview with INSEA is just how easily they were able to blend this sort of in-person digital communication. So in the longer interview, she talked about how they're working in different countries on TikTok and WhatsApp and different platforms that I'm certainly not familiar with, but perhaps not having the weight of sort of protocol behind them that the larger agencies have. Irene, you are, I guess, more involved quite recently in some of these things, but do you think agencies are ready to be that flexible? What do you think are some of the things that we need to be looking out for?
Yeah, well, I think what INSEA said there about the time spent getting approvals, if you're a larger agency, to get the message out there is spot on. I think a lot of the communication that is happening around COVID-19 in social media spaces, from UN agencies, from NGOs, from, you know, larger, more bureaucratic organizations, is that, as always, we're looking for perfection. We're looking for risk communication perfection. And as INSEA said, while we're getting approvals from 4 or 5 managers and tweaking a social media card to make sure the color is just right, there are lives being lost. And I think there is a real challenge, I think, that we have in the way that we're doing risk communication, is that we have this almost obsession to control the message. And because of that, and because of the approvals and the bureaucracy, quite often the information coming out does appear quite sanitized. And I think that makes it very hard as well for people to really relate to the messages coming from larger organizations. And, you know, Internews isn't, of course, out of the picture on this. I think we all have this challenge, is that this kind of sanitized messaging that doesn't fit the context. You know, one of the things we're seeing at this stage in the crisis is, of course, we've always talked about the infodemic, that there's, you know, too much information out there for people to sort right from wrong. At this stage, a lot of the perception studies are showing that people are feeling utterly overwhelmed with the amount of information out there. And I think, to me, that points to the fact that we don't need to just keep pumping out facts. You know, that's not the way that we're going to be able to defeat misinformation, by just continually pumping out more facts and more facts and more facts. Facts aren't the only thing that will drown out misinformation. What we need is a bit more of a nuanced approach, where we look at, of course, the facts. they're important, but also, you know, the emotion behind these rumors, the motivation behind why people might choose to believe a rumor. We need to look at the context where this information is going and step away from that kind of sanitized regional or global messaging that is top down, as Insia said, and is designed to be one size fits all. That's not something that when you're sitting at home looking on social media, you look at and you don't see that and say, well, this is a message for me. You see that as, well, this is a corporate message for the world, and it just doesn't feel relevant to me. So I think definitely we need to be in the social media space. We need to be where people are. And for many countries, that's online. But we need to think about how we're doing it. And we need to loosen some of those shackles, I would say, and be able to react faster and to be able to react in a much more appropriate way that actually meets people where they are and talks to them in the right language, as Insia said, of course, in the right language, with materials that make sense in that context, that might not feel perfect when you're sitting around the table in Geneva or New York or wherever you're designing these things. They might not look right in your context, but might be perfect for the context where you're trying to get the message out.
Connie, we'll come to you. I mean, we've got lots of time to have a discussion, but just if you have any reflections on the video. I mean, you write a lot about rights and what's in terms of this level of digital access, is this something that we should be plowing into, and what are some of the things that we should be looking out for?
I guess I'll just share 3 things that struck me from that that presentation, which really was quite lovely. I guess I might say it made me think about trust, systems, and time. And what I mean by that is that, you know, one of the things that I think is so wonderful about that initiative is I think that the speaker was absolutely right. Like, you know, in some ways, like the material that comes from the WHO is trying to do a lot of different things at once. But when we think about, for example, how misinformation is sort of is working right now in certain systems, how is that perception about misinformation changed? It's often changed mostly when a trusted person tells you, you know, like, hey, hang on a minute, here's like the way to think about that. And I'm not sure that that voice would ever come from the WHO as an established organization. That voice is going to come from local communities who are able to sort of explain, like, I understand your context, I know what you're worried about, and here's why I trust that information. So I think about trust. It made me think a little bit about systems in the sense of, right, like, this is clearly right now a current crisis, and there's a way, and the time issue. There's a way that we respond in a crisis situation. And so one of the things that I think is wonderful about that network is like it was able to emerge so quickly in such a short period of time. But I do end up thinking about the long-term effect about these things. And I wonder, again, like with some of the things mentioned earlier, over time, is that an initiative that might want to, you know, say like, you know, we were great for that period of time, but we might want to sort of fade away afterwards because we might not be equipped to answer some of these very complicated questions. And what I mean by that is that these systems are technological systems that are not built by the people who are using them. So what that means to me is that there are things embedded in a logic, like in terms of computation, in terms of how systems work. And once we become communicator actors in that space, I think we also have to recognize there's responsibility that we might be taking on in terms of sharing that information. So this thing, that example about, protocols for interviewing children versus interviewing adults. Not everybody understands like, oh, maybe there's like risk that I end up including by including different people in that community. So anyway, those are some of the thoughts that I had.
I think that's a good segue. And we've actually raised lots of different issues that we will come and revisit. We wanted to bring in another one of our video clips, and this is really we're going to be hearing from Sandra, who is from Kuja, and they describe themselves it's a feedback system. It's a real-time feedback system, and really I think for lots of people social media is the very definition of digital technology, but this is a case where we're using artificial intelligence to support human thinking and to make some of our community engagement friendlier and more accessible. So let's hear from Sandra and pull out some of those issues before we move on to what should we do about this.
My name is Sandra Garcia. I'm the CEO of Kuya, an organization who uses technology to help humanitarian organizations to have a better feedback loop with communities and put communities' voices at the center of decision making. What we think is that by having information available in real time will help organizations to reduce significantly first that feedback loop, and also if we use simple methodologies, is much easier for organizations to really interpret what communities are saying. So what we do is we build a tool, a platform on the cloud that allows organizations to collect feedback from communities in real time. It's available right away there, and we process that data using machine learning algorithms to synthesize this information that comes from communities really fast, so that organizations, once they see the data that is coming from communities, at the same time they can see what are the main topics or trends that communities are talking about, for them to be able to react. For the teams on the field, the frontline teams, to read and react immediately, not having to wait until a long processing time takes place, etc. So we have an app. We developed an app that works online or offline, that is managed by our teams or by the organizations, partner organizations teams, to go to the field. We have different ways of collecting data, but this is like the simplest one, to go to the field, ask 2 questions to the customers. One is regarding satisfaction, how satisfied they feel with the services they are receiving, because we believe so much that we need to treat refugees and displaced as customers with the right to say if things are good or not. And the second question we ask is to give us an open idea on how his situation or the services could be improved. And that's everything we do. This information goes to the cloud, immediately available. And with our technology, we start extracting topics to see what is the biggest trend in the community, what type of concerns are emerging, etc., so that the organizations, once they read, they identify simple actions to be taken immediately or in a very short time. That's how it works. Part of the feedback that community gives us is how to communicate better with them, which channels of communications work for them. So for instance, in Colombia, they have said we use a lot Facebook. Facebook is huge here in Colombia for the migrant community with whom we work, so we use this channel. Some of them say we prefer to listen to radio, so that's a way to communicate back. So, but the important thing here is that we decide how to communicate back to communities depending on the communication channels that themselves they give us, they tell us to use. So it's not easy. Sometimes organizations feel a little bit hesitant to share what they have been doing, but I think as we evolve in the process, they feel more open to share information. And that's the process where we are moving towards, but let's see how it goes.
So another example there, I mean, drawing maybe on Suya on what you were saying, this is really about accessing communication that already happens. And I think accessing in a way that should really revolutionize the way that we work. Irene, I'm going to come to you first, and with a similar question. I mean, you talked at length about, what we need to be doing and some of the complications. But do you think this is this what we've been looking for in terms of, simplifying the way that we do things? Is it enough for what we need in terms of linking better?
Yeah, well, I think it sounds like a really great project that she's working on. I think the question is what we're trying to understand. And always the question we should always be asking ourselves in humanitarian response is the so what. So we know whether people are happy or unhappy with our services specifically, and I think that's a great start. But by perhaps limiting to those very specific questions, what else might we be missing that people might want to talk about? That there could be things that we could work with non-traditional humanitarian actors, civil society, local media, and other organizations to really respond to those challenges. The use of AI, I think, is really interesting because it's definitely something that is starting to come up more and more in humanitarian response. And I think it can be a really useful tool, because I think the first step of designing a feedback system, any kind of feedback system, is making sure you actually have the capacity to understand the feedback and to do something with that feedback. You know, I think quite often we see a lot of feedback systems that are designed that collect piles and piles and piles of data, and then don't necessarily have the capacity to really quickly analyze that data and then to actually act on that data, which is the most important part of that feedback loop, to not just be constantly asking the community what they want and what they need, but actually to have the capacity to do something with that information. Because if you don't have that capacity, then frankly, you're raising expectations, you're wasting the community's time, probably also wasting donors' dollars as well. So I think it's always good for us to look at, you know, what amount of data we're collecting, whether we need that sheer amount of data, do we need, and does a lot of data necessarily translate into better actions? So I think that would always be my guiding question around these kinds of responses are, if this tool helps us to understand huge amounts of data, that's wonderful. But then we really need to always keep in the back of our mind that the most important point is, now that if we do now understand that data, what are we actually doing about it? What are we actually doing to go back to those communities to make the changes? And are we truly being accountable and letting that feedback guide how our response works?
Thanks, Irene. I might throw it to Nancy, I think. I mean, Nancy, you spoke first, and so we'll give you a chance to come back in. I think it's, you know, Irene raising really important questions there. We're collecting lots of data. What are we going to be doing with it, and how will we use it? So we're drawing out already a little bit the contradiction that we have in ourselves, where we want to be kind of loose and free, and we can, in order to be able to understand these parallel communication and make use of it. But at the same time, we know that we need to have you know, these systems in place to be able to understand it. Do you think we should be using this sort of AI, and would it be good for would it improve the analysis of the data that we have?
I mean, Irene raised some really good points about, you know, if you're asking a question, where are you prepared to answer it? And I think in many cases, people may not be. And I would also point out that people may also be asking questions that really don't apply to your organization. We would see that definitely on our UN social media platforms, where people would come and they would have concerns about an election, assuming that the UN does election monitoring, and it does in some cases, but in many cases it doesn't. So that's a real challenge, I think, for organizations that, and the audiences, to not really understand where to channel their questions. I think in the example that you showed, the app is really, that's innovative, and something that a challenge is that apps need to work on various platforms and various types of phones. And many people have an older version of a phone. And that's just something that if your organization is thinking of creating an app, that's pretty disappointing if it's not going to work on the particular platform that is most common in a particular region, or if there's not also a way for people who don't have a smartphone, which I'm in Kenya, and I do see a big number of people still are using phones that are not considered smartphones. And then I would also say, people will, are they also making comments on a platform that you don't have the capacity to monitor, like perhaps WhatsApp? And are they making comments in a language that your team doesn't have the capacity to even understand? So that's where I think AI and some of these other tools could help, by figuring out how to scale and monitor some of these platforms, identify trends. I mean, there's machine translation is getting so much better, but it's not perfect. So I think those are the kind of ways where I think that AI is really encouraging. And then of course, the demands on reporting are so huge for humanitarian organizations and the UN as a whole. So anything that could help capture and store data for analysis is certainly welcome. But it's, as I said in my earlier question, learning how to use these platforms when you're responding to a crisis is a huge challenge in itself. And you don't really want to test something on, you know, a very serious crisis, but in reality, you probably will be doing that. So thanks.
It's interesting that you brought that up. I mean, obviously we couldn't show the full interview, but Kuja, we're talking. I mean, really there, the tech is the machine analysis of what you were saying, Nancy, in terms of language and analysing the priorities from the questions. So they also have enumerators and do the data collection in lots of different ways. I'm going to come to Connie last, but maybe Anna, Suya. I mean, the ability for artificial intelligence to really open up this natural language community engagement using instant translation machines, like Nancy had said, it should be a great thing for better humanitarian response. Do you think that's right?
So I think I'm going to come back to two things that Connie said and that Irene said. I think we always have to ask ourselves the question, what are we using? Why? No tool, no architecture, digital or otherwise, is neutral. Everything has politics. And so therefore, why do we choose something is very much dependent on what we want to see out of it and what we're using it for. And trust, which I think Connie mentioned, is such a key element of this, even when it's in digital space, because trust ultimately boils down to two people. It's a relational thing between humans. You can have reliability of autonomous systems and more machine-based work, but at the end of the day, what we call artificial learning, which a bunch of us in the sector dislike intensely as a term, is ultimately data sets, deep, complex statistical analysis on data sets that are themselves flawed, because our data is never perfect. Who tells the story, how, with what data, with what evidence, is always going to have implicit power differentials in it. And then who does the computational work, what are the algorithms, are also in human hands. So again, natural language processing has been an amazing thing for translation. It helps us in so many different ways. But when we also start thinking about sort of machine learning or AI in mapping, for instance, and we don't have adequate data sets, or we haven't questioned those data sets that we get from governments or wherever we get them. And like Irene said, the problem is all of this is happening in crisis. So we're trying to move quickly with imperfect information. We could be doing more harm than less. So I think we need a very strong consciousness of the tools we use and why, the complex power dynamics inherent in them, and at the same time using them as best as we can, recognizing they're imperfect. But I know Connie will have a whole lot more to say on it.
I think so too, and we'll turn to Connie. I mean, maybe just to say that, with Sandra, we had a long part of our interview was talking about how they don't collect any personal data, they don't, they just collect the answers. But really interested in what you think, Connie.
Yeah, I just thought it maybe share sort of some ways that AI works, and maybe that will help illustrate the point. So I think a short term and long term. I like to think about time scales a lot because that's my background as a historian. So short term, amazing examples of how AI can help, for example, election monitoring violence, right? So like, for example, if you're interested in trying to figure out like, how do I actually provide help to people that might be experiencing sort of like intimidation at the polls, etc. There are a number of different projects that I've seen where they'll take sort of different instruments to kind of sift through all of the things that are going on social media and try to alert for violence. All these potential flags, number one, have to go to human curators because, you know, machine's doing its best guess related to what that violence means. And then, you know, you need people to parse it, but also if people actually need help on the ground, you know, here's a great thing that has happened in that space. But then again, thinking about it, right, even as I just said it, how do you define violence to a technological system? It depends on the people who are defining what that violence intimidation looks like. And so based off of the conceptions and the experience of the people who are, you know, sort of crafting that system or curating that system, it's just going to have an impact there in terms of maybe what kinds of events get elevated more, right? In terms of that feedback loop, that's something that computer scientists also need, right? So all of those libraries that are helping to inform NLP, they're definitely coming off of like trial and error and experience in terms of how those things are built. So I know many computer scientists who know that they're limited and they want more information, but it takes time to build those libraries and to kind of say like, oh, we didn't think about that. So then in terms of that long-term thing, a couple of things that I kind of fret about. I'm a fretter, so this is what I do, I fret. So two things that I fret about can maybe be exemplified in these examples. Again, like in a disaster-oriented situation, what one would want is you just need to provide help. Like how do you provide help to people who are suffering immediately? And then yet I also think, can we make sure that the data that's shared about that help doesn't get used to inform, say, future insurance actuarial tables? In other words, when people give their data for a specific moment in time, how do we make sure that it's used for that purpose and not for extended purposes? Especially the way that, again, systems work and technology. The final example I'll give is that in a completely different context, when people are uploading their videos to YouTube, one person shared with me just the knowledge that, and I'll use the example of, when you Google for images, that's very interesting that it works, right? Like you can say cats and you can get a lot of cats. And actually that's a huge jump in terms of technological kind of interpretation. And this person noted that he is a father and he was actually the primary caregiver of his child. So he carried around his baby, basically, as this baby was growing up. But when you Google for caregivers, those are often females. And why? Is because many people have uploaded their lovely videos to YouTube of themselves carrying their babies, and they happen to mostly be women in terms of that particular data set. So just try to think again about those long-term things, like when we use the technology for immediate purposes, how those layers might be kind of building in, but also as we continue to use them, what kind of information are we feeding into that system, and how is it going to be used in the future? So thoughts.
That's great. Thanks, Connie. And thanks, everyone. I mean, I think it is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but we've touched on, I think, lots of the key issues. And we wanted to take this opportunity to do what I was saying earlier around a temperature check. So in the questions in the comments box now, there'll be a link to the Mentimeter site. So as our audience, if you can open that link, it will prompt you to put in 3 words on how you're feeling about this peer-to-peer, this use by communities of a more digital approach. So whilst you're doing that, I think we're going to be sharing the screen so that we can watch. Let's wait and see whether we can share the screen. So I think we're going to try and answer a few questions whilst this is going on. So I guess, sorry, so coming in, we're going to try and answer, whilst people are doing that, we'll answer a couple of questions. So Prashan asks, will we see some humility from humanitarian actors to move away from the language of capacity building and say they may not be the experts here? So I think we'll need to ask one of our humanitarian actors, maybe Nancy, sorry to put you on the spot. Nancy, what do you think? So Prashan asks, will we see some humility from humanitarian actors to move away from the language of capacity building and say we may not be the experts here?
I think that's a little bit unfair. I mean, I think some are doing that, and some are really willing to listen. But I think that is where, some of our peer-to-peer feedback is helpful. And perhaps even events like this where we share that kind of expertise and feedback. I mean, I do want to say that people. I think that humanitarians, they're so well-meaning and they're so overwhelmed. So I think if perhaps some of that sentiment could just be coming from exhaustion and stress for trying to do the right thing, and then also justify your actions. But yeah, I'm confident that that things will change. You have to be.
Thanks, Nancy. So the other question is from Uncoerced, sorry if I got the name wrong, who asks, how can AI help us avoid the trap of us reacting to the loudest voices rather than the voices of the most vulnerable and the mute? And on a related note, Lauren Perez asks, how do we ensure feedback is uncoerced and true? Maybe I'll, Anna Suya, I'll put you on the spot for that.
I don't think it's AI that's going to help us do that as much as it is the recognition of our own positions of power. And to Irene's point earlier, I think, yes, we are all well-meaning, and at the same time, we have to be conscious of sometimes doing harm without intention, and thinking about our work as being a connection of multiple expertises. And so in that vein, exactly as Connie said, it's not AI so much that will help us move beyond this, but for us to recognize the power that is inherent in data, to recognize that we are not going to get the kind of data that is secure, safe, and as plural and expansive as we need without elements of trust, safety, transparency, reliability, and accountability to the communities that are most affected. And I think that goes to the other question you asked as well, which is that if it is a connection of multiple expertises, to recognize that it is an insider-outsider, where the communities themselves, and communities are not homogeneous, have certain kinds of expertise, is really important. At the same time, I'll just say one thing and then stop. I'm also concerned when understanding of misinformation can sometimes be about a binary between fact and non-fact. I think it's much more nuanced than that. I tend to think of it as a continuum between fact, multiple opinions, multiple truths, propaganda, and lies. And we know that both certain people in communities, certain institutional actors can be on the side of propaganda and lies. And we have to be very conscious of the way that the reach and speed of digital communication is used on the side of propaganda and lies, including, as we all know, WhatsApp, Facebook, Viber, all of them. And so I think it's still very human. The problem is extremely human, is what I'm trying to say. It gets expressed in different digital forms.
Thanks, Anna Suya. And Nancy, you might have seen a shout out for your positivity there from Fernanda, so it is welcome. Irene, maybe I can come to you just for your reflections on the Mentimeter. I think it's super interesting. I haven't seen this before, but you can see the words that came up most is excited, curious, anxious. We've got worry in there, culture, hopeful, pessimistic, all manner of things. So Irene, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is great. I think it's really interesting that excited, curious, and anxious are almost around the same size, because from my point of view, I think at the end of the day, how we feel about communities using more digital communication tools in a way doesn't matter, because they're going to be using them either way. So we need to find a place where we can be comfortable with that being the reality, and work out where we fit into that picture. And I think a lot of that is around it. And from the question earlier that went to Nancy, I think a lot of that is around us recognizing our limitations, working out where we are really well placed to be in that space, and where we might be better placed to be supporting communicators that are already in that space. You know, thinking about non-traditional humanitarian actors, thinking about other information influencers that exist in that space, and perhaps using some of that humility to take a back seat and saying, hey, we'll support you to do what you're already doing quite well. We have a whole range of skills and tools and things available to help you out, but we don't need to be in front of the camera. You take your space, you have the trust of your community. We're here to support you, but we're here to help. So I think you can see that, where is it? There was one pardon my head going on the side trying to read them all, but there was one that basically said that it's unavoidable and it's in there somewhere. And that's kind of how I feel about it. It's unavoidable, but I am excited and curious and anxious all at the same time about it. But I think it's something that we just need to start working into our systems and making sure that we do try harder to understand and, yeah, like I said, recognize where we can have strengths and where we can support and where we have limitations and when we might need to take a back seat.
Thanks, Irene, and thanks everyone. Yes, I'm also on the side. There's one that says obvious. It's quite small, but I think we probably concur. So thanks very much, everyone, for filling that in. And we're going to take a chance. This was a bit of a whistle stop. We're going to slow down a little bit now, and we're going to talk about, so where do we go from here? We want to move the discussion on. But first of all, we'll go to our final expert clip that comes from our discussion with Malad Azad Hamidi, who specializes in community digital projects. He started his work when he was a refugee and has since been very much involved in peer-to-peer communication using technology. So let's hear from Azad before we move on.
My name is Milad Azad Hamidi, and I'm a journalist and social media expert. I've been busy working with peer-to-peer groups and moderating peer-to-peer groups. To be honest with you, 5 years ago when I came to Europe, most of my friends didn't know something like Google exists. They didn't know they could ask things that they don't know. They can ask Google through it, or they can ask information through that, or the locations and stuff. But now it's completely changing, and it has nothing to do with the humanitarian sector. Because the humanitarian organizations, they always try to provide information. The way they provided was they created their own Facebook page or a website, and they just uploaded information again and again and again. What they missed, the point was that the community cannot trust that information that's coming from the humanitarian sector. They trust more the information or the things they hear from their own community, and most of the time that's not face-to-face because it's not possible for them to meet each other. So it's all digital. And things, it's very now interesting for them as well. Most of these people who came here, the refugees, now they have a passion for the digital, for the technology on things that they can work on or they can study. The way the groups are shaped is that one person is member, he goes and invites all other members, all other his friends. So from the friend list, from 50 of them, 5 of them joins the group. And from these 5, they meet other people. And now when you see it in a way, every member in the group have another chat group in Messenger where they can meet different people. And for example, you see people with vulnerable situations. You see women making their own groups and having their own chat room where they can talk to each other. And also there's one new feature in groups called rooms. So this is a place where more specifically people who have disabilities, for example, they can't hear, they can't talk. Most of them are in one group, but that's not a Facebook group. That's basically a messenger group where they can literally talk to each other, call each other, send a message. Yeah.
And you were talking about the entertainment one. Do you think that is that just about entertainment, or do you find that actually is a channel that can be used for other types of information?
It does. It's used for different types of stuff. For example, if I've seen videos that they want to basically transfer in very serious information, but they put it in a funny shape and it looks funny and it looks entertaining. So the guy is coming and sharing it in this group. People think it's a funny thing. It's something that makes them happy. But in reality, it's the main information that has been transferred to them through these different methods that people use. It's basically creativity, and it's not coming from biggest companies. It's not coming from organizations. It's coming from within the people. People think about it and they find solutions on how they can transfer things that they want to share with other people. So they find the best way and they share it on the groups that they find it relevant.
So that was, we all went off video. So that was Azad there. I mean, Nancy, coming to you first again. I think we were talking about issues of trust. We've heard this this example of peer-to-peer communication. What do you think? This is happening already. How do you think we can connect with that? You can't emulate that sort of trust. You can't emulate those sorts of conversations. And you talked about the complications of setting that up in a crisis. So where do we go from here? What do you think is our role as humanitarian actors?
You know, I think in terms of gaining trust, you have to make sure that the content is meaningful and that it also, you know, includes people that look like the people that you're communicating with. And that, so the days of, you know, one piece of content that can be shared, you know, globally are really long gone. So you really have to figure out, have this real understanding of the audiences and what a young person might want to see, what a woman might want to see, what someone in a crisis would want to see versus in a donor country. And that is that's hugely challenging. It's hugely time consuming. You know, and it's interesting about, I'd love to learn more about this concept of trust, because on the one hand, I do see that there is, you know, mistrust in organizations and you know, perhaps in some countries that's because of, you know, the way the media is. But then at the same time, you see that a lot of people really trust what they see online, and what they're finding might not be accurate. So I think that is a really interesting, and if we can crack that nut, would really help us as communicators figure out, why do some people believe some things, and why aren't they questioning others? So that's like a real source of, you know, frustration on our end when we see things going viral that are completely not rooted in fact, and yet people feel comfortable sharing that because they got it from, you know, their neighbor or something. I mean, the COVID forwards that I got, some of them were pretty shocking about these, you know, strange herbal treatments. And why do you trust that and then not trust something that you see on you know, a vetted media outlet in some part? I mean, this of course varies so in so many parts of the world, but I guess, like I said, the first thing that is just making sure that the content you're producing is actually authentic and means something to whoever is going to be receiving it, and it's on a platform that they're actually using.
Thanks, Nancy. Maybe Anna, Suya, the same question really. As I'd outlined an example of peer-to-peer communication, you know, this was you know, popular, and the uptake is because it's relevant. It's now it was through multiple different means. So what lessons do you think we can learn to sort of stop this divergence between what we need to deliver and what is actually being discussed?
So I think, you know, I'll come back without belaboring the point to the fact that this has always happened. Right? There have always been multiple sources of information in a community. There have always been some more trusted than others. There have always been gatekeepers to information. And the forms are shifting, the speed is shifting, but that inherent nature of information and knowledge still stays. And what Azad was talking about, which was so powerful, is the fact that it's not just the trust of the people that you see, and Irene mentioned that as well. You tend to trust those who look more like you, who certainly speak the same language as you, who come from the same place as you. But it is also about imagination. It's about what are the forms in which that, even in the midst of crisis, the creativity with which people are communicating what they need to communicate is, to me, fascinating. That may or may not be the information we want them to have in exactly the forms we want to have it, but there is a deep connection, I think, to the ways, to the memes, for instance, the music, the TikTok video that is, you know, based on a Bollywood song versus what is seen perhaps as a dry WHO piece of information. I think the really interesting thing is to make those connections happen in ways that the trusted information carriers within communities and across communities have the information they need that they can use in creative and multiple communicative ways. So I think it's something that we're seeing all the time. I totally agree with Irene. Some of the things that I have seen come across my WhatsApp from family and community in India is appalling. And at the same time, there have been some really interesting counter videos and counter memes and counter TikTok videos that are actually deeply rooted in good fact, in medical knowledge, but presented very, very differently. And so I think that's where, again, the connection of multiple expertises, including in the forms of communication, are so important.
Thanks, Nancy and Suya. I think agreeing largely on that. Connie, maybe to come back on the point you were making earlier, we quizzed Azad on, on this issue of giving up data rights and, were they concerned about data being taken and how it was going to be used. And, perhaps obviously he was saying, well, this isn't a highest priority for people, communication is. And I guess in many ways, in a similar way, I'm a bit the same. I know the risks of using these platforms, but I still do. What do you think about that? How do we work with this issue if it's a priority for us, but it's not a priority for communities? What are some of the specific things that aid agencies should be engaging with on that?
I wonder, let's see, I'm trying to figure out if I can answer your question by answering it slightly differently. So one of the things that struck me about that interview, which was, and again, just another great example of how creative people can be, is that I'm struck by how we talk about right now, and I think I saw this in the chat too, communication, I think sometimes we morph and we think about it as a one-way communication. I'm trying to communicate something to you. And then sometimes there's this question about two-way communication. And the only thing that I feel like to kind of help expand this picture is I'm very interested in trying to help people understand how these internet communication is always two-way communication. It's never single. And the reason why I say that is that even if you have a website, you have a person who goes to a website because of IP address and infrastructure, all this other stuff, you are, even if you're just clicking on it, you are actually communicating to that website your interest, among other things, several things. So it's just to kind of think about, sometimes I think we have this metaphorical issue of trying to figure out, am I trying to use WhatsApp as a telephone line, or am I actually using it more like a forum, like a public square? And there's this thing about internet technologies that it's so hybrid, which is so creative, but it's also actually quite confusing, I think, in terms of our own mind. Do we think we're doing a single way communication or a double way? What's going on there? And so as we, whether we have our institutional hat on or our individual person hat on, I think it's where I think agencies and organizations just can help do, because their role is often that slower thinker, right? There's things that happen immediately on the ground, then there's some things that are that organizations try to do over time, right? So could it be that there are great resources to kind of leverage in terms of how to think through that communication? Could that be one way? But I also think in terms of really, in addition to the one-way, two-way communication, again, is about that relationship, which I think people have mentioned. What is the relationship we're trying to establish in our communications? And I think something like the WHO, implicitly in its communication is basically is trying to make an argument upon scientific expertise. Whether you agree with scientific expertise is another question. Maybe it's that we have to be more explicit about these are assumptions we're coming in with, I don't know, and saying here's the information that we're trying to say. Maybe there's something in that relational, that relationship that needs to be clarified. But anyway, some thoughts.
Thanks, Connie. Irene, come to you on this. I mean, I think many of these powerful communication tools are provided freely to refugees and people affected in crises by tech giants and fully funded because of advertising, et cetera, et cetera. What role do you think we have remaining when it comes to these sorts of communications? Is this, how can we remain relevant when there is this kind of risk that it's running away?
Oh, well, remaining relevant is always great. Obviously, that's an aim we want to aim towards. I think we do have a responsibility entering into the digital space to take our humanitarian principles with us. So if we're engaging with refugee and migrant groups, displaced groups, any communities affected by crisis, that we do also use that as an opportunity to think about do no harm and to think about the digital risks that might impact on someone in that space, but might also translate IRL in real life into the place where they're also living or moving to, depending on their situation. And I think that's something that's really important for us to consider when we're thinking about the information ecosystem, is how the actions online might translate into risks in real life for communities that are already really vulnerable. It's something at Internews we've been trying to get our heads around as well, and trying to think about what's the best way to really understand the risks present in the digital spaces where crisis affected communities are existing, and try and think as well about what's the best way for us to work with those communities to make them more aware of those risks. Like you were saying, I mean, at the end of the day, it's always still the decision from that person as to whether they still use those platforms or how they use those platforms. You know, we all know that there are particular risks even for us in using these kinds of platforms for our communication, but like I said, we do it anyway. You know, but that's based on an informed decision that we've been able to make. And I think that's at the core of all of this, is making sure that we can find ways to engage around these risks, communicate, give people the information that they need and want, and then leave it for them to decide whether that's the platform they still want to use, or whether there's a different platform that might be better for them depending on their circumstances. But I did want to just really quickly go back to the conversation that was happening before around rumors, and very short, just because it's my big bugbear, is I feel that whenever we're talking about rumors being spread about COVID-19, so often we're talking about people over there spreading rumors, as if it's people that aren't us. You know, COVID-19 is a situation where the science evolved so fast that I would say every single person that is on this panel, every single person that is watching this panel has spread a rumor, not intentionally, obviously, at some stage in the crisis. And I think the more that we talk about rumors being spread by someone else or by other communities, or by saying, I can't believe that they believed that, especially when we're in a situation where people are so information vulnerable, and there are just so many gaps in our knowledge around this virus and how it spreads, and especially for communities that are more digitally disconnected, the more we have the them and us mentality, I think that really also presents a barrier for us in really communicating around those rumors, and really thinking about the genuine beliefs or the quite, you know, genuine misunderstandings that might be behind some of those rumors spreading, and being able to meet people where they are. Rant over.
Thanks, Irene. Does anyone else want to have a rant? No. I think there's nothing wrong with a good rant. I mean, I guess one of my questions actually was, are we just a little bit overexcited about this? But I don't think we sound it. We've been talking when we were setting up this, we wanted to look at, you know, is this the opportunity to be more accountable to people? If we know that, you know, this communication has always happened, but this is an opportunity to link us better with that, whether or not, you know, we as global actors are following it appropriately. So shouldn't this be an opportunity to address some of the issues that we have around accountability, and just deepen our listening skills? Maybe just to open up to you guys for just some reflections on that, and whether this is an opportunity, or whether we really got some hurdles to jump before that is the case. Maybe Connie, come to you first.
Could you actually rephrase your question, or ask it one more time, because I think I got it, but I just want to make sure.
I mean, we're coming towards the end of the session, and I think we wanted to end with some kind of actionable next steps, which we won't get to, but we wanted to move the conversation on beyond risk and beyond some of these sort of warning signs that we often, the conversation finishes there. Do you think that this is an opportunity? We've seen these examples of peer-to-peer networks. We know that this happens anyway. This is communication that if we could tap, we could increase our reach, we could get messaging, we could have dialogue more easily. Is this an opportunity for us to be more accountable? Are we ready for that? Can we overcome some of these big hurdles?
When you say we, do you mean we as the humanitarian community?
Yes, we mean humanitarians,
Just
our
cool.
audience.
Just wanted to make sure. So I think, yes, it's always a great time to have that. But I think, right, like one of the interesting things would be, how do we have that conversation knowing that technology will continue to shift in every single like month to year, right? I think this is right. One of the super big challenges, right? Like as the technologies themselves are changing, like it's like the rug is being pulled out from under you. So if anything, it's like, what would be interesting to talk about as a community in terms of holding ourselves accountable, knowing that that technology can change. And so the one example that comes to mind recently, or right now is really top of mind for me, is how a number of different countries are exploring or discussing whether or not they want to regulate unencryption of closed messaging spaces. You know, should that happen, I think that the technology will change. And so then in terms of the communication networks that are going on right now, anybody who is acting in those spaces should be, you know, like aware that that could potentially happen. How does that going to affect their communities? Again, though, this is a long-term kind of planning question. So I think this question of like, how do we immediately respond and sort of like maybe just help, you know, immediate disaster response be as effective as it can be, knowing that there's all these like huge challenges ahead, like, and maybe then also too, like, as much as we can, knowing that we have to be in these spaces, how can we be generous to one another? I think it's just so hard. I think what everyone who's doing work in this space is trying their best to support communities that they care about. So maybe how do we create those conversations like this one and spaces where we can have open-hearted exchange about how to make this better? Like, I think the more that we're able to build supportive accountability, knowing that people want to improve the space is maybe a great way to go.
Thanks, Connie. Nancy, coming to you. Do you think this is our opportunity?
I mean, I guess I don't think we have a choice. We have to embrace it because if we're not using these platforms in the right way, it's you really would seem out of touch. And you know, I share what you know, what Connie mentioned is that these things are constantly changing. And so it will always probably be an opportunity that we are going to have to figure out how to embrace. I think one opportunity that probably is overlooked is learning from not only other humanitarians, but other sectors. And I mean, that might be a little bit controversial, but I would say that, or at least pre-COVID, airlines were really great at solving, you know, online complaints and online problems. And we're right on those platforms a lot as their customers, or even, you know, so, but they are using some tools which, you know, to manage a customer service mindset is really probably cost prohibitive for most NGOs and certainly for many UN actors. So I think those are the types of ideas that we'll have to figure out how to bring those costs down for platforms that would help you really manage, you know, customer responses and tracking for good, of course. I mean, I know there's obviously drawbacks, but the reality is if people make a complaint about something or a comment, they expect a answer or response probably much quicker than any of us are in a capacity to give. So yeah, I guess it is an opportunity, but I don't know, also a giant burden as to, you know, figuring out how these things change going forward. So good luck to everyone.
Thanks, Nancy. And I guess this is a really relevant topic, isn't it? We heard last week from Mark Lowcock, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, that failing to listen adequately to people was the single biggest failure in the humanitarian system. I guess what we're wondering is whether this continued proliferation of digital communication is an opportunity to allow like truly localized parallel communication, really accountability, something that would make us accountable to communities in a way that is not so top down, but it is, we really wouldn't have a choice. I guess that's the opportunity that may be opening up in a similar way that we humanitarian actors are accountable to media in a country. If I could send that sort of expanded question and maybe start with Irene.
I think what I would say is that we don't need digital tools to be accountable. I think it's like me saying, I'll be able to lose weight if I get a really fancy treadmill. If I really wanted to lose weight, I don't need the fancy treadmill. What I need is willingness, not tools. Definitely digital tools could be one way for us to be accountable, but I think the most important way is for us to actually try and look at that narrative that we tell ourselves, that we want to have an accountable humanitarian response, and we want to have a humanitarian response that is designed by and influenced by the communities we work with. At the moment, with or without digital tools, do we genuinely let communities evaluate our programming and genuinely listen to what they have to say? Do we genuinely change our approach on what they want, not just what we think they need? Do we collect feedback to actually genuinely engage, or to report, or to amongst ourselves and to our donors about the fact that we've asked whether we've done a good job? Do we actually engage? And I think that's the bigger picture. These tools might be wonderful. They might be another way for us to look at the accountability question. But what's most important and what can't be replaced by a digital tool is that willingness to genuinely have a responsive humanitarian response that is designed and led and is more bottom up, and where the community is at the center of that decision making. And that's where we're really struggling. If we're going to use these tools for accountability, though, I think we really need to properly commit. As we were saying before, and I think as everyone has said, we need to be quite aware of the risks that are implicit in some of these tools. We need to look at our limitations. If you have people monitoring social media, for example, and engaging with the community, they shouldn't be treated as the lowest pecking order of a comms unit. If that's going to be a really key tool in our response to really listen and understand and engage with the community, these kinds of roles need to be really elevated. And of course, you need to make sure that we can actually close that feedback loop. So to make sure that if we are doing the listening, we have the capability to do the doing, to actually respond. I think one limitation that I've definitely seen in terms of the way social listening tools are being used so far in the COVID response is that quite a lot of the social listening is happening through data scraping. So it's scraping huge amounts of public data and generating huge amounts of reports. But the question is always who we're actually listening to. And I think we know that there's a digital divide, and of course, not everyone is online, that's fine. But I think the other thing that we're really missing in this way that we're currently trying to engage with the community is, one, it's not really engagement. It's taking data. It's like, for example, having someone tell you something in one ear and then you walking into a completely different room and saying the answer to an auditorium of other people. There isn't a feedback loop happening in the way that we're doing social media listening at the moment, but also we're missing most vulnerable groups. What we found in the Rooted in Trust project is that many vulnerable groups use social media in really distinct ways. We found that, for example, women in Afghanistan often don't have access, but if they do, they're using pseudonyms and they're using closed groups of only women that they discuss amongst. Similarly, in Colombia, we're working with LGBTQ migrants who don't feel safe, of course, openly communicating about their status. So, of course, use closed WhatsApp groups. In Lebanon, Syrian refugees are using closed Facebook groups to share information. All of these groups are missed in the data scraping approach. So what you're collecting misses their voices. And if, as humanitarians, we're here to listen and to serve the most vulnerable, then I think we need to have a look at our processes and whether that's actually what we're doing at the moment.
Thanks, Irene. Really important collection of reflections. going to come to Anna Suya to reflect on what everyone said on the same question, but I just wanted to re-emphasize, how loud does the communication have to get that's peer-to-peer, and you know, it happens outside of humanitarian? How loud does it have to get that we're answerable whether we like it or not? Is that within our reach? Will that happen?
I think the humanitarian sector always has to be accountable, especially to silences, not to loudness. And to Irene's point, I think really to recognize that we will always have to be listening in multiple spaces, whether that's digital, physical, and everywhere in between, because people are telling us what they need, communities say what they need in different ways. And the most vulnerable are not on Twitter, they're not on WhatsApp. If they're on WhatsApp, they're on WhatsApp in different ways. And communities are very sophisticated about how they use digital technology when they have access to it. That's the other thing. They are far more sophisticated than many of us might think we are. So people understand safety and security in different ways. The way that I think about accountability for the humanitarian sector from my sort of inside-outsider perspective is three things. Keeping in mind what Connie said about shifting and changing technological landscapes. One is that in order to center the expertise of communities and knowing that they know best what they need in a crisis, the only way we can be accountable to that is to think of distributed responsibilities, right? So that recognizing that it's not a decentralized versus centralized argument. I think that's a pointless binary that often comes up when we think about digital communication. It's about distribution. Some things are going to need centralization. Some things will need to be much more localized. Which is what, for what, is really important to understand, and starting from the community out rather than the telescope in perspective is going to be very important in analyzing that. The second thing is accountability around resources. I mean, we haven't talked about that so far in terms of actual in resources beyond communication, but this matters, right? How do we make sure that resources are as localized as possible? Because we know that with the humanitarian sector, there is a danger that resources actually don't reach the communities that are most affected at all, or very, very in limited ways. What is our accountability around that? And then the third thing I'd say is influence. I think where and how the humanitarian sector influences what in a digital age is going to shift. And by that, I mean, there's the kind of influence that I would like to see the humanitarian sector have is both the influence that is about listening from other sectors, as Irene talked about. This is also different forms of expertise. You're going to need to understand tech deeply from those who have that expertise. But the way that the internet works, the way digital technologies work, there's still the on and off button around physical infrastructure. And that on and off button, to put it really bluntly, is very much in the power and control of governments and corporations. When humanitarian agencies can shift their influence to making sure that digital technology is actually accessible and not, for instance, shut down. Just as an example, India has had the highest number of internet shutdowns in the so-called democratic world in the past few years. Right now, there are people in India who are not getting the information they need via so-called digital technologies because the Indian government has shut down access, for instance, in Kashmir. What is the role and the accountability that the humanitarian sector has towards influencing that level of access? I think, so I think where the humanitarian sector influences and what it influences is going to shift and change based on the technical landscape. And at the same time, I couldn't agree more that accountability is always going to be about much more than the digital.
Thanks, Suya. Unbelievably, to me, we are coming to the end of the session, and I think we've touched on, you know, I acknowledge at the beginning that this was a really large topic that we were taking on, and we've touched on lots of different issues around the risks and what we need to be much more aware of. Some of the things Suya just alluded to then around these much bigger power issues around power, issue around different things that we would need to grapple with. We wanted to end with, as we were talking about peer-to-peer communication, we wanted to end with some comments that have been made within the chat box. So I'm just going to read out some of those. So from John Zoltner, misinformation has always existed, but is becoming weaponized by the ability of misinformers to communicate with massive groups of people. From Fernanda Baumhart, with risk communication, why do we insist on saying it's community engagement when it's not? And also, is it we? When will we start replacing all the we's by they in this? Uncoerced, does peer-to-peer communication show that digital information groups are at risk of becoming a bubble? Lucas Crook, this is the most interesting and insightful panel discussion I've seen recently. Also, I think the use of AI and apps by humanitarians too often appears like a technological solution looking for a problem. Simple approaches appear to me to have the most potential. Carolyn Davis says, rather than think about abandoning the notion of capacity building, we could think about two-way capacity building. Humanitarians understand we do need to learn from community members. That was from Carolyn Davies. Ricardo Lobo, one way to gain the trust of the community is to support building their values. And Oriana Kutnik says, I hope to see this conversation continue and expand its reach and breadth in the broader humanitarian community to foster increasing system-wide growth and transformation. So thanks everybody for those comments, and I'm sure there were lots of questions. We will try to get to them afterwards. Really, this is digital access, and the title of this is going to be the central focus for CDAC this year. We're going to be talking specifically around some of the issues of accountability, how we can better understand digital access and the way that it can support with lots of the questions that we have around communication, accountability and community engagement with our members and with anybody that's interested in our public forum in October. So look out for what we'll be doing before then, and do sign up to our newsletter and sign up for information about that. In the meantime, I said this is not a new issue. You look on the CDAC website, our members are doing a lot in this space, so you can read more about it. So it just leaves for me to say a big thanks to our experts who gave up time for the interview. So that's Insia, Azad and Sandra, who bared with us for hour-long interviews, and we learnt a lot about that, and we'll hope that we can invite them back to the public forum to tell us more. And huge thanks to our panelists, to Suya, Connie, Irene and Nancy, our all-women panel. Today we did have a brief conversation about what we thought. It's not a manel, we didn't like wanel, we didn't like womble, so we decided it's the revolution. So, but ladies, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for being transparent, thanks for being open, and thanks for bringing your perspectives. And thanks to everyone in the audience who has stayed with us for this full time and joined us and been very active in the discussions. Thank you to everybody.